Recording. Yeah, you're on now.
All right, well, so, yeah, I think, Doug really kind of made the case for why this is important. And so I'm going to talk about how you can do this in your own backyard, how you can, replace your lawn or your invasive species with natives. And I think it's important at first to start by saying, how am I defining what a native plant is? And people still argue this point, but I think a reasonable definition is plants that were here prior to European settlement. Because, Native Americans did alter the landscape somewhat, but not to the degree, that it's been altered since European settlement of the area. So these are a couple of our native plants in Kentucky. On the left corner is the blue Lobelia, and up on the right is the common milkweed. And another important thing when you're talking about natives is to talk about a region that you're referring to. So when I'm talking about natives, I'm talking about those from, basically central Kentucky, southern Ohio, southern Indiana, into northern Tennessee. I think some people, when they're talking about natives, are speaking about it very broadly, natives of North America. But I try to encourage people to use species that are as close to this area as possible because they are most likely to thrive here. And again, Doug pointed out the changes that we've made that have caused our need to replace these species, and I just wanted to bring that a little closer to home. Here in Kentucky, there's a lot of information in these maps, but the upper one is pre-settlement land conditions, and the bottom is Kentucky now. And just a couple, things to point out. This is the inner bluegrass region of Kentucky, around Lexington, and this was originally bluegrass savanna. And that's this area now, which has basically no examples of that natural community type remaining. We've really had to kind of do a lot of detective work to try to figure that out and to recreate new areas. Because that area is the soil is so rich, it was a real desirable place to settle and farm. Another thing I wanted to point out, because this was fascinating to me, when I first moved here, I didn't realize that Kentucky was a prairie state. But this is the prairie region of Kentucky, this gray here in a circle, and then here in further western Kentucky. We have more than 2 million acres of prairie, they estimate. And what we have now is about 2,000 acres remaining. So again, it just shows you the importance of not only protecting those existing areas, but we need to do more. We need to restore additional areas to bring back both the plants and those animals that depend on them. So the first step, I think really creating a native garden isn't that much different than creating a regular garden. I think you just keep other things in mind too, but the first step is really getting to know your property. And I really think it's important, and I never wait that long, but in theory you should wait about a year when you're living at a place to really get to know what conditions you have there. So what the sunlight conditions are, and I always go out in the wintertime and think, boy, this is pretty sunny. And I still do this, but of course when the leaves are out, it really changes. And even artificial structures in our yard can create shade in an area that you think might be sunny. So you really just have to watch that area throughout the entire growing season and year to become familiar with the light levels. And you need to think about moisture. And also, you need to remember, I think, it's important to remember when you're, even in a very urban setting, in an urban yard or a suburban yard, you are within the watershed of a creek or river. And so what you do in that spot really has an impact on the river. And so not only think about how much water is available, but how much water is coming off of your rooftop or any paved surfaces. How can you absorb that water to keep it from eroding soil? Or if you're in an urban area, how you can keep it out of the combined sewer system. How can you soak up that water rather than causing overflows into the streams when we have heavy rainfalls. So that's important as well. And you need to think about the soil type. I think the good thing is that a lot of native plants can be adaptable. I have pretty nasty clay soil, and I think that's pretty common around here. But just become familiar with the soil so you know which plants will do well here. I think some people take the attitude is I'm going to improve this site so I can grow what I want But what I think is more practical is to see what site you have and then find a group of plants that will work within that site. And it really, I think, takes a lot less work, and that's appealing to me. And also, just think about things like physical boundaries of buildings, pathways you want to have, how you will get access to the garden, views you want to keep or hide. I think, we want to do something good with the garden, but I think it's also important that it be a functional, beautiful, enjoyable place for you. And so I think those are important things to keep in mind as you create it too. I think the more you love your space, the more time you'll spend in it, and I think the more you'll care for it. So, if you want a more open view, think about that. If you want to hide your neighbor's house, there are options for that as well. So take all those kind of considerations into account when you're first planning. And the cool thing is, we have a lot of diversity here in Kentucky, and we have diverse landscapes. So whatever conditions you find in your backyard, you'll be able to find a suite of species that will thrive in those conditions. So if you have a very shady space, we have many different types of forests and woodlands in Kentucky. From dry upland forests, and I think those can be really tough conditions, that dry shade. Man, I can't think of anything that would survive there, but there really are plants that are really happy in those conditions, that are native to those conditions. And even to wet woods, if you have those conditions, shady area but with some moisture, you can find plants that thrive there. If you have a really hot sunny yard, the prairie species are a great choice for that. They're gorgeous, they attract a ton of insects and birds, and just a really fun addition to the landscape. This is a dense blazing star in a prairie in western Kentucky. You probably don't want to make a cypress tupelo swamp in your backyard, but if you have a wetland, if you have a wet backyard, there are also herbaceous perennials that do well, and there's a really cool native wetland called a temporary wetland. And I think that's a really effective group of plants. A lot of people in their backyards will have flooded spots and dry up. And there's a group of plants that thrive in that. They like that wetness in the winter, early spring, but they can survive drying up as well. And even if you have this gravelly soil, people always want to put a bunch of better soil on top of it, but really there are a suite of plants, and these are good ones for boxes, right? They are able to withstand drought and really poor soil conditions and full sun. This is native to Kentucky. This is our one native cactus, the prickly pear cactus, which is surprisingly beautiful when it's in flower. And edible too, which is kind of fun. A lot of work, but it's tasty.
And it can live during the winter?
It does. It doesn't look great in the winter. It kind of gets all shriveled up, but it survives and then comes back. So this is the next step, and I think people get a little bit intimidated by this, but I think it's really important just to draw a sketch of your yard. And I probably, for me, this is kind of fancy. Mine are hand-drawn on graph paper, and I think it just helps you to visualize, to get a sense of how much space you have, to get a sense of the locations of your existing vegetation. So you can see, what room do I have, where is it sunny, where is it shady, where do I want to start? I think it's good to draw it out, and I like to, just personally, I like to take off a chunk at a time. I get totally overwhelmed when I have to think about planning the whole area. So I think, okay, I'm going to start with the front yard, this area to the left of the doorway, just do this 10 by 20 foot area, start there and move along. But really whatever suits you. If you like doing the whole thing, then that's great. But just do a sketch like this. I just paste things out rather than measure it with a tape, and I think you get close enough for the purposes of planning where to plant. And I think this is a good, once you get familiar with your area and the conditions, then draw it out on a piece of graph paper so you can visualize and get a sense of the area. And then some basic nuts and bolts. You want to lay out the shape of whatever garden you're creating and remove the existing vegetation. So that's the not very fun part, I think. I think it's easiest if you have just lawn or sod. And you can use herbicide. I don't like using herbicide, but it is an option. For bigger areas, I do use that, because if I'm doing 3 to 5 acres of restoration, I haven't found another method that really gets rid of the weeds to the point where I can return the natives. For smaller areas, you really can do something like smother it with black plastic. You do need to leave that on for several months to kill off the vegetation. I think it's great to leave it on for a few months, take it off for a couple weeks, put it back on again before you plant. There are also organic herbicide options, and these are mostly citrus-based or vinegar-based. I mean, the issue with them is they are not systemic. They don't go into the roots and kill them. That's what like Roundup does or other commercial herbicides. They just top kill the leaves. So you just have to realize you will have to do multiple applications before the roots will die out. And you know, with sod, you can also just, the root systems of turf grass are really shallow. So you can just, you know, use a sod cutter or just a shovel to cut that layer of lawn off. So those are different ways you can get rid of the existing vegetation, but it's important that you do that. You know, the native plants are tough, but they can't outcompete something like turf, or if you have like an old field, those invasive exotic plants. And I think people are used to tilling, but you really do not need to do that. And in fact, I found it's better for the plants if you don't do it, better for the soil and for the plants themselves. What tilling often does is create a hard pan, especially if you have clay soil. So those tines, as they rotate, they kind of smooth the soil and create this hard clay base that's more difficult for the plants to penetrate. And so what I do is just, you know, dig a hole into the existing soil and put the plants in. And I'll show it later, but the roots of these native plants are incredible. You know, they go like 15 feet deep, which, you know, it just amazes me. And they work through that soil, aerate the soil, create pores, you know, to allow moisture to get through better, build up carbon. So those roots themselves can really kind of break up the soil and you know, do that better than a tiller would do. So I'm not a big fan of mulch, but for the first couple years of a native garden, it does help to put mulch down to keep the weeds down and help keep moisture in, because you'll be spacing the plants kind of far apart initially to let them fill in. So my goal in a native garden is to have it very full and no bare ground visible and no mulching needed. But initially, it does help to put some down between the plants. And I usually use a shredded hardwood mulch. And I have found that if you're planting perennials, I like to put the mulch down first, because then you can just scoot it aside, put the plants into the soil, kind of put it back in place, rather than planting all the plants and trying to carefully put mulch around each one of those. And when you're planting trees and shrubs, I like to, you know, plant the plant first and then put the mulch around it. It's a little bit easier with those larger species. And the fun part, I think, is the plant selection. And of course, you want to choose plants that will work in existing conditions, right? And I think that's obvious, and I think we all try to push our luck sometimes if we have a favorite plant. But, you know, these native plants will do really well if they're in the right spot. So a sun-loving plant needs a sunny spot, a wetland plant needs moisture, and just work with what you have to provide that. One thing I do advise when you're choosing plants is to avoid cultivars. And I think most of the native plants sold in big box stores are a cultivar, which is basically a clone of one individual, right? So let's say they found a purple cone flower that was unusually short, and they liked that. So they cloned that individual over and over again. And it gives people this kind of tidy look and this consistency that a lot of people like in their garden. But there's also a downside to that. One thing is they've shown that many of those cultivars are not as nutritious or easy to access as a food source for wildlife. So it varies, and they're still doing research. But from my perspective, you know, I want to grow these plants mostly for the wildlife, and if there's a chance it won't help them, I'd rather not use it. The other issue is, so this is like a native population of purple coneflower, grown from seed, so you have a variety of different individuals. And so you have different heights, it's maybe a little irregular, maybe a little messier, different petal colors, shades of purple. But you also have other variations that create a healthier population. So you have different individuals, some of them are better able to withstand a cold winter. Some are better able to withstand a long drought, right? So by using the true native, you also have, more protection, I guess, against the vagaries of our climate and other conditions, because they have different abilities to withstand that. So another thing to think about is flowering time. I think that's a fun thing for ourselves, right? To have native plants don't flower typically throughout the entire growing season. They'll flower for, a 3-week to month-long period perhaps. And so you want to choose different species that will be in flower throughout the growing season. So it'll be pretty for you, but mostly so you'll have an ongoing nectar source for many of your pollinator species. So that's really beneficial to them as well. A third thing you want to think about is weediness of the plants. One thing I always hear from people, oh, those native plants are so weedy. But the truth is, some are weedy and some are not. And you really have to choose what's appropriate for your spot, right? If I'm doing 5 acres, then it's a good thing to have some weedy species. I want things that will spread and cover the area before the non-natives come in. If you have a very small plot, a weedy plant can become pesky and something that you have to pull out over time. So there's a system of ranking for weediness for the native plants in Kentucky. It's called the Coefficients of Conservatism, kind of a mouthful, but it's on the Drop Seed Nursery website, and it ranks plants from 0 to 10. And this is a native plant, ragweed, that is very weedy, that I wouldn't put in my garden, and I don't sell, but it's given a rank of a 0. On the other hand, you have plants that are very difficult to get to spread, that they're very picky about the type of environment they're in. They can't grow just anywhere. And rattlesnake master is an example of that. This is a really cool prairie plant that it's a nectar source for parasitoid wasps, which don't sound that desirable, but in fact, they lay their eggs in the tobacco hornworm caterpillars. And the eggs develop and they kill the tobacco hornworm. So for example, my husband is an organic farmer, and he has rattlesnake master in beds within his vegetable garden, and has really seen a decline in damage to his tomato plants. So, and it's also the only food source for a federally endangered moth. It's a mouthful. The rattlesnake master borer moth, who lays its eggs in the base of the plant, and the larva develops in the roots over the winter and then emerges the next year. So a really very cool plant. That's given a 10. Not at all weedy. And then you have plants somewhere in between, like the cardinal flower, gorgeous, beautiful red, midsummer flowering, and that's about a 5, right? It'll spread somewhat, but not super aggressively. So I think it's good to just kind of make those choices based on your site, and then also kind of getting plants that are in a similar range, right? Another kind of myth about native gardens is they don't require any weeding or maintenance. And I think that's like a dangerous myth, because then people end up with a very unattractive, not very diverse native garden, because 1 or 2 species will really take over time. And if it's not one of the native species taking over, it's one of the invasive weeds that will come in. So really, just like any other garden, you do have to maintain this over time to keep that diversity and the native plants in there.
Can we do questions time to time?
Of course, no.
So
right
do you
now.
normally label your plants when you're doing your layout? Like, how do you remember what you put where?
Oh, you know what, so I usually have a drawing,
Okay,
because labels just always get taken up by squirrels or, you know, something else, or critters, or they fade. So I like to just have a drawing.
and then how do you acquire some of your plants?
So-
Seed, friends,
Right.
family?
So, you know, I have a nursery, Dropseed Native Plant Nursery, and what I have done is, over the years, collected seed with permission from different remnant natural areas throughout the state, and I grow them up in either gardens or seed production beds. And then I collect those seeds. I sell seeds, but then I use them to grow up plants in the nursery too. Any other questions? Yeah.
I have a question, basically from Thanksgiving till 1st of March, because Doug had said it, and Margaret Carrero was always talking about overwintering insects.
Right.
And leaving enough material for the overwintering insects. But I hate wet leaves, I just hate it. So with my beds, what should I do with them as far as, do I chop up the leaves? Do I just have a few leaves? What do I do? Do I have something other than dirt there between November and March? But I don't want to have any disease or anything like that.
Right. So that is kind of tough. I will say, part of it is, so, I mean, in my garden beds, right, I leave all the plant material through the winter, and I don't cut anything back until early April. And that provides food and habitat, you know, for these insects. But then on areas of lawn, it is better to leave the leaves for insects. But at the same time, you're gonna lose your lawn, you know, so I think over time, maybe creating beds for leaves or mulch piles for leaves, because the more leaves you can, you know, let sit over the winter and not mulch up, not cut up, the better. But it is a balancing act, you know, with still having some lawn as well.
Well, that's basically what I've done. I
Yeah.
try to keep my beds pretty clean except for natural materials.
Right,
And then maybe in the corners, especially around the fences, just leave it be.
yeah. I think that's a good, you know, compromise kind of.
Okay.
So you also want to consider height and width of plants when you're planting them. You know, you want it to be attractive. You want the plant height to be appropriate. I really like the big 6-foot tall plants. They're really wild and fun, but they might not work very well in a suburban front yard. In those cases, maybe the shorter 3-foot tall plants might feel more appropriate and less overpowering. And also, you know, kind of work it so that the plants can go from short to tall so you can view them. And typically I plant my perennials 18 inches to 2 feet apart. And that's a good rule of thumb. For the trees and shrubs, you really have to look it up species by species, but for the perennials, that's a typical spacing that will allow them over time to fill in. And so, yeah, just consider that in your planning, those kind of attributes. And then I feel like sometimes when I listen to Doug, I feel like inspired and a little overwhelmed, right? I mean, there's a lot to think about. There really is. And my rule of thumb is, okay, I may not trust myself to remember everything, but I trust these plants, right? And the more diversity I can introduce to my yard, the better, right? So I think it's great to just kind of, and I think it's good to have masses of individual species to keep it looking tidier. You know, maybe 5s or 3s are nice. So, you know, maybe not, I don't know, 100 different species in a small suburban yard doesn't make sense. But the more diversity you can have, the better. And not just diversity of species, but, you know, have some trees, have some shrubs, have some perennials. I think that's just kind of my little mantra. I might not get it exactly right, but I'm going to have some diverse species in there. And I think another thing to consider is, you know, like, there's a thing about native plants being so messy, and, you know, people get upset about that. And I have a little bit of trouble with that because I like messy. Like, I think that's fun. But I also really want a broad array of people to love and experience native plants. So I get it. I think you can do them in a way that looks more tidy. And I want to make that clear to people too, so that they're not turned off by it. You know, sometimes I worry, my gardens are pretty wild looking. But you can make these native gardens look tidier. And it's really a matter of, you know, I think having some kind of edging, whether it's just little rock edging or a little fence or something like that, the shape of the garden can help, you know, make it look more defined and more intentional. Again, grouping plants, I think that's very helpful rather than just having, you know, a mix of a lot of different species. Have clusters of the same species, 5 of this species, 10 of this species in groupings. Actually, they say that that helps many of the butterflies hone in on the plants. Many of the pollinators, having that display can help too. So those kind of things can help in creating a garden that's tidier, neater, if you know that's more appealing to you. So finally, I just want to go through some of my favorite Kentucky native plants that I think work really well in home landscapes. This is kind of a stretch, but it's just my favorite. And the oaks are so important for so many reasons in terms of attracting a ton of insects and then birds, but also for their carbon sequestration. You know, they're just a big tree that can really help soak up carbon dioxide. I think around town they've planted so many pin oaks. Pin oaks are great, but it's nice to get some different species, and bur oak is just fabulous. You have to have enough space for it, right? So don't plant it if you don't have enough space. It'd be really sad to see it cut down in 20 years. It really stretches out, you know, 40 to 50 feet wide. It also has the coolest acorn in the world. It's like this big and it has little eyelashes. Super cute. So, if you have the room, I think this is just gotta have it. If you have smaller space and you want a tree, black gum is a really nice tough tree for suburban spaces. It'll grow in clay, it'll take air pollution. It's really beautiful. It turns this bright red color in the fall. It does produce a fruit, kind of like an olive-shaped fruit, but there's males and females, you know, so, but even if you don't get the fruit, you know, it's attractive to a lot of different caterpillars. But the fruit is also actually attractive to the birds as well.
How big do those get?
So those get more in the range of like 30 to 35 feet, maybe 40 feet versus the oak, which is 80.
Do they get very wide?
They're not as wide as the oak, maybe 30 feet wide. Yeah. And Doug mentioned this, but pawpaw is a great native tree here in Kentucky. And in nature, you see it in shady areas. And it gets kind of long, tall, and spindly. But people are actually growing it now commercially for fruit production because the fruit's so tasty. And they grow it in full sun. And in that case, it gets very full, shorter, maybe more like 20 feet tall, and more fruit production. So this is a flower, which actually smells like rotting meat to attract that beetle to it.
Yeah.
But I will say it doesn't like fill your yard with the smell. You have to get up to it. No. But it has these beautiful leaves with a beautiful form, and it attracts the zebra swallowtail caterpillar, which is just stunning. Stunning. So very fun one to plant. Smaller tree, and nice that it can grow in either shade or sun. I think, you know, we all love dogwoods, and they are a gorgeous tree, but they're kind of struggling. I think we've planted them in yards in full sun, and they really can't take that. And there are a lot of diseases that are hitting them. So this is a nice option. It's a native understory tree. It gets about 30 feet tall, similar, you know, to the dogwood, but it can take sun better than dogwoods can. So you get this beautiful display of flowers in the spring, and then little red berries that you can just eat right off the tree. They're delicious. You have to beat the birds, which is a challenge,
Yes.
but it's worth it.
So they can take full sun?
They can take full sun. They actually, you know, a lot of those understory trees, they survive in shade, but they like some sun. Not all of them, but this is one, yeah. It flowers better, it fruits better. And some shrubs. One that I really like is spice bush. This is a shrub for shade. So if you have like a wooded area with some bush honeysuckle in your yard, and you're getting rid of that, this is a great thing to replace it with. It needs shade, it likes a little bit of moisture. Again, it has male and females, so just the females have the red berries, which the birds love. It has this great scent. You crush it, like this almost minty scent to it. And it gets typically like, I would say 6 to 7 feet tall. And it is the only food source for the spicebush swallowtail caterpillar. And I don't even think I have a picture of the butterfly because it's the caterpillar that's the cute one here. And this is actually its rear end, which it has these little fake eyes on to make the bird think it's a snake to avoid getting eaten. And it's amazing, like Doug said, you know, you plant one of these and right away, I had actually a spice bush in the nursery in a pot still, and it had one of these on it. And I think I sold it right away because of that. That person would have paid extra. This is another great shrub, very adaptable. You know, a nice foundation plant for your house. It just gets about 3 feet tall. Coralberry. It is native to shade, but again, will grow in full sun. It gets this beautiful fountain-like shape. It will spread somewhat, but not too aggressively. When the tips of the branches touch the ground, they root into another plant. But they really do have, you know, this many of these maroonish berries throughout the winter, and the birds will feed on it over time.
So back to the spice bush.
Yeah.
If you had shade in the morning, but then, cause like I'm thinking of my backyard, in the morning I've got shade, but in the afternoon I get almost full sun.
That would be a bit too harsh for that one.
Oh, okay.
Like if you had sun in the morning and shade in the afternoon, that would be better.
Oh.
You know what I'm saying? But that harsh afternoon sun,
Yeah.
unless the area is wet. In that case, you know, it would make it if it was wet. But.
Okay.
This is another gorgeous native shrub, Virginia sweet spire, which has fragrant white blossoms in the spring and then beautiful red leaves in the fall. I mean, just, you can't beat this one. And again, just about 5 feet tall, so it can work as a foundation planting around your house. And this will work in part shade to full sun. This is like, oh, be still my heart. This is not the invasive honeysuckle, right? This is a native honeysuckle called trumpet honeysuckle or coral honeysuckle. And the amazing thing about this species is it flowers mostly in the spring, but it also flowers again, like throughout the whole growing season. And it will grow in part shade, but it does best in full sun. You really get more flowers in full sun. And we have this by our screened-in porch, and we just sit there and watch the hummingbirds all season. It's a delight, just a delight. And there are birds, or there are insects that feed on the leaves. Birds nest in it. You know, it creates a berry that's food for birds too. So it's just an amazing, amazing species.
Is it, like, I have one that's more like a vine?
It's a vine, I'm sorry, I should have said that. So
Yeah.
it is a vine and it requires a trellis of some sort to grow up. Ours is growing up all the way to the second story of our house, but you can prune it back also. So now some perennials, a few for shade. Christmas fern is a great plant for shade. You know, it can take clay soil, it can take, you know, really dry conditions. It can take even a little bit of sun. So it's super adaptable. And the nice thing about it is it stays green all year round. That's why they call it Christmas fern. They would use it as a Christmas decoration. So it gives some color, you know, even in the wintertime to your garden. And for shade, I love the native grasses. They're more subtle, but I think they're important to a lot of different wildlife, and they're beautiful, and they keep their structure in the wintertime. Bottlebrush grass is just about 3 feet tall. It'll grow in full sun, full shade. And it does get these little bottlebrush-like looking seed heads that the birds love. And some shade-loving wildflowers include woodland poppy, which some of our shade-loving plants are just ephemerals, right? So the leaves and the flowers will die back after the first 3 weeks of spring. So it leaves a pretty bare garden after that. So a poppy is one that will keep its leaves throughout the growing season. So it makes for, you have at least interesting green colors and textures in your garden once the flower's done. And flowering at the same time as the wild geranium, these really make a great combination. And again, they're super tough. They'll grow in clay soil. They don't need a lot of rich soil. And they will spread and colonize over time. For sun, this is the namesake of my nursery and my favorite native grass called prairie dropseed. And it just has this, it's about 3 feet tall, and it has this very sweet fountain-like shape, very narrow leaves, so just very soft. You want to pet it on its head. And it's cool because it flowers in the fall and it has this amazing fragrance, which is very unusual for a grass because they're wind pollinated, so it's kind of mysterious that it has this fragrance. And it's kind of like spicy and unusual. So it's great. It's very drought tolerant. It'll take clay soils or sandy soils, full sun. It's a little bit slow to establish, but it's worth the wait.
Do you cut that back in the fall?
I cut it back in the very early spring.
Oh,
I like to leave those blades, you know, sometimes bees will actually overwinter in the hollow stems of some grasses. So I wait till probably the first week in April, cut it back, when you first start seeing it green up. And this is just showing you the root systems of these plants, which is just incredible. That goes to 15 feet deep. And on the very far left, that's turf grass. So just showing you how, you know, one reason why these plants are so drought tolerant, right? Because they get deep down into the soil.
Why they sequester so much carbon.
And why they sequester carbon, right? That's 15 feet of not just the roots, but all the roots from past years that have broken down and are forming new soil. This is a really beautiful, I'm kind of going to go through sun-loving plants from spring to fall. Some fun ones for your yard. This is called Golden Alexander's. It's related to Queen Anne's lace, but it has a broader leaf. And this is the only food source, well, it's a food source for the giant swallowtail butterfly, which also will feed on parsley. But it just gets about 3 feet tall, and so it's great for, you know, a front yard garden. Foxglove beard tongue is another one that I really love. It'll take a little bit of moisture, but doesn't require it. It's about 3 feet tall, and these deep-throated white flowers are a great nectar source for a number of different butterflies. And we get to midsummer, the great blue lobelia is a close relative of the cardinal flower I showed earlier. And the cardinal flower, well, it's beautiful, it's got that red color, but it's a short-lived perennial, right? So it typically lives 2 years and then dies. If it's in just perfect conditions, which are kind of partly shady, kind of moist conditions, it will reseed. But the great blue lobelia is so much tougher. It's longer lived, it's more adaptable to different conditions. So, and it also just attracts a number of hummingbirds and butterflies.
what size is that plant?
About 3 feet.
Okay.
I'm going with some of the shorter ones, you know, that work well in a front yard. So swamp milkweed is my favorite of the native milkweeds. The common milkweed is great, but it's very aggressive. It spreads both by seeds and by underground rhizomes, so it can be pesky, especially in a small yard. So the swamp milkweed doesn't spread like that. And despite its name, it doesn't require wet, right? It's great in wet, and it tends to get bigger in wet soil, you know, maybe 5 to 6 feet in wet soil. But I have it just in average soil in my garden, and it does just fine. And again, it's the food source for that startled me. It's the milkweeds are the only food source for the monarch butterfly caterpillar. And again, it's just amazing. The first year you plant them, you know, you'll see those caterpillars on the plants. And then the flowers themselves are also a great nectar source for a wide variety of bees and butterflies. Yes.
We actually have, I think 2 of them out in our little butterfly garden here. And they're dead now.
Dormant.
Yeah, so well,
Sorry.
yeah, I mean.
But it's different, right? They go dormant in the winter and they come back.
Yeah, so should they be trimmed off or just left?
So you can leave them if you want. I do tend to trim them back,
Okay.
again, early spring.
Okay,
Yeah.
that's what I needed to know.
Yeah. And now we're getting into fall, and I think, you know, goldenrods kind of get a bad reputation. The Canada goldenrod is super aggressive, right? And I wouldn't plant that in my garden, it just takes over, but there are, you know, many really nice native goldenrods, and the gray goldenrod is just like 2 feet tall. So it's very sweet and not aggressive, and these are nice. It's, you know, fall is a hard time to keep your garden going, you really want to have that nectar for the wildlife, especially those monarchs who are getting ready to go to Mexico, for goodness sakes. You know, they need some nectar. So this is a great thing to have for your later season garden. And then asters flower at the same time. Aromatic aster is fabulous. It really is. It flowers all the way into November, depending on the weather. And it's one of those kind of mounding species that forms this nice circular form. The flowers are not fragrant, but the leaves are aromatic when you crush them. And they just have, I mean, often 6 weeks they will flower and just attract, you know, so many different insects. So those are just a few of the fun native plants you can add to your yard. And you can find these at Drop Seed Nursery. We're a small operation, so we're only open seasonally in the spring and in the fall, Fridays and Saturdays, 9 to 4, starting the end of April for the spring through the end of June. Any questions?
Where are you located?
Yeah, that's a good one. We're in Goshen,
Okay.
which isn't too far. We're out 42, if you know where the St. Francis School is. We're just past that on South Buckeye Lane. And we have a website, dropseednursery.com, and we have most of our stock online, so you can kind of get a sense of what we're selling and what will be available this spring.
Will you be selling like locally, like you used to?
I know, I used to do that, but now I've gotten older and it's just
Yeah,
hauling the plants from place to place.
yeah, it's hard.
And I've gotten people to come to me, so I appreciate that. Yes.
So,
Oh,
sorry.
sorry.
Go ahead.
Okay. So, like, when you start your garden, can you start from seed, or do you need to germinate them and?
You can start from seed. That's another approach too. And I tell people it's like a 3-year process, right? And what I do is you start with bare soil. I like to sow the seeds in the winter, because some of the seeds need to go through winter time before they'll germinate. So I put them in just on the surface, water them in December. The first year, one thing you can do is just cut it back periodically that first year, because you'll get a lot of weeds coming in, and that's just one way to, you know, keep those weeds down and still let the native leaves start up. So just, you know, cut it like 2 feet high with a weed whacker for that first growing season, and then let it go. And by the 3rd year, you'll see flowering. What I have found is when you're doing it from seed, it's better to just do a mix, right? Do a mix that includes half of native grasses at least and half of the flowers. Because those native grasses have a different root structure that helps keep weeds out. So if you try to do like sweeps of like, you know, purple cone flower, sweeps of orange cone flower from seed, it's really difficult to keep the weeds out during that phase of them germinating. Does that help?
Yeah.
Yeah.
So we're on a 100
That's a lot.
year old property, it's
Oh.
7 acres.
Okay, cool.
But it was vacant for some years.
Yeah,
And vining and honeysuckle took over.
yeah.
And I hate to say this, I've cut quite a few of those plants down when I was cleaning out the
Oh.
woods.
You know,
But I have these red buckeye trees that keep coming up in the woods.
ooh,
And I keep tagging them.
cool.
But
That's-
are those native plants?
That's a fabulous native
They're
plant.
beautiful.
They are gorgeous. They're slow growing, but man, those are fabulous.
But they
I
are
might
native,
make a
you
deal
think
with
they're a
you to
native
get some
plant?
seeds. I'm sorry, what was your
Well,
question?
when I go around the property, I'm going, why did they plant that tree there?
I know,
I mean, it was like crazy stuff.
yeah. That's great. That
Yeah,
sounds beautiful.
I've seen them, they are.
Yeah.
yeah.
Any other questions?
How about soil types? How do you know?
So you can send them to your extension agent and
How
get,
do you do that? How far do you?
they'll give you a little kit
A
and they
kit,
tell
okay.
you how deep to go, and you know, you usually go to several different spots
Yeah.
so that you get a sample.
Numerous samples.
Yeah,
And it's free, I think you get 2 or 3 free
Yeah.
samples that they'll analyze for you. And you'll tell them if you want it for vegetable or if you want it for flower, and they'll let you know what
Yeah.
you need to put in to amend it if you need to.
right. Well, thank you all very much.
No,
Thank you.
Thank you.
Yes.
Yeah.
And yes, if you would fill out the evaluation